So I'm very happy to welcome Arthur Glenberg from University of Arizona here in Montreal, so to speak on the centrality of emotion to language. His resume, which you've probably seen, is that think about the content of language in venues other than academia. For example, conversations among friends, novels, movies, musical lyrics, etc. It is predominantly about emotions and feelings. I will eventually ask a question about what's the difference between emotions and feelings. Emotions seem like a special kind of feeling. Furthermore, the relation between emotion and language is not just in regard to content. I will review literature demonstrating the impact of emotion at multiple levels of language, including phonology, prosody, syntax, word meaning, sentence comprehension, and discourse structure. And I'll end with Art will end with a couple of suggestions to why there is such a strong connection and what it means. And I invite people who are doing a sentiment analysis in their projects to ask questions with relation between this treatment of emotion and sentiment as it's measured with your software. Professor Glenberg is an emeritus professor at Arizona State as well as at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I hand the floor over to him.
Thank you very much. And that was a great introduction indeed to what I will be talking about. And
I hope it was great. It was your words.
Oh, that makes sense. And I want to reinforce what you said, that I really am looking for critical questions and comments on this, because I've pulled together these ideas. I think they're coherent, but I'd love to hear from other people in that regard. I do have this one warning that, if you're at home and there are young children around, be warned, there's going to be some R-rated language in this talk. And so you may want to cover their innocent ears for that. Let me start out with just a little description of what often happens during dinner in my house. This is my wife, Mina Johnson, and she's standing in front of a tuned mass damper in one of the tallest buildings in Taipei. And the tuned mass damper is there to counter earthquakes, to adjust for the sway of the building so it doesn't topple over. And Mina uses VR to create educational experiences. And she was telling us about how she finally got a VR system to help teach about tuned mass dampers. And so she was really pretty happy about what she was telling us about. And then this is my daughter, Lavinia, and what she often talks about is things that she's done with her boyfriend. And so she's talking about things that she finds joyous. But, sometimes, we don't always talk about happy and joyous things. And if we're talking about the war in Ukraine or about the devastation of COVID-19, those things are definitely sad when we're talking about them. And then when it's my turn to talk, since I'm generally the science nerd at the table, I might be talking about excuse me, might be talking about something that I read recently that I just thought was such a fantastic experiment. There's such a fantastic scientific idea. So, the events that we talk about aren't explicitly about emotions. I'm not talking about what it means to be awe or what it means to be sad, but we talk about events that we find interesting because they evoke emotions. And it's not just this dinner time conversation, but whenever we read a novel or poetry, when we watch a movie, when we listen to the lyrics of virtually any form of music, it's all about emotion. So a huge amount of our non-academic discourse is about emotional situations. But in contrast, there's very little concern with emotion in our cognitive theories of language. And the question is, are we missing something here by not treating emotion and language more seriously? So here's the thesis of this presentation. Going to claim that emotion is central to language, that emotion pervades language at all levels of analysis, at least as far as I've been able to determine. And it's in terms of content, like I was just talking about, but also in terms of these standard cognitive activities of production, perception, and learning, in terms of activities that are more language central, like prosody and syntax. We see emotion in meaning and in comprehension. And I'm going to propose a little later on that emotion might help us to structure discourse. So let me first offer a gloss of what I mean by emotion. And just to say it simply, is that it's a bodily state that drives or motivates actions. And so I mean physiological states such as hunger, thirst, and pain, but also more social cognitive states such as joy and anger and sadness. Now, I think probably many people who are scholars of emotion would object that throwing these sorts of things together is incorrect. But at least as a start, to think about how emotion and language intersect, I don't want to make too many distinctions here. And I mean this idea that emotion, just going back, is a bodily state that drives or motivates actions. I mean that to be consistent with one account of emotion called the functional account of emotion by Keltner and Gross and others, where they propose that emotions function to drive action of all sorts, to drive interpersonal responses to threats and opportunities, to drive interpersonal coordination, and to drive culturally appropriate behavior. I also mean it to be consistent with the more recent account of emotion proposed by Hutchinson and Feldman Barrett, where they use some of the formalisms of predictive coding to apply to emotions. And hopefully I'll have time later on to get into the details of this predictive coding account. But just to prime your interest, one of the things that Hutchinson and Feldman Barrett state is that affect is part of every psychological phenomenon, even those that are not explicitly emotional. And so I take that to be that affect is part of learning and part of perception, part of categorization, and part of language. And you'll see how this plays out, hopefully, a little bit later on in the talk. So let me first review some of the research that seems to show that emotion is central to language. We talked a little bit about content, but now let me talk about sort of some of these standard cognitive processes, excuse me, of production, perception, and learning. Sort of interesting, even though I'm talking to you by Zoom, I have my lecture voice on, and so I'm projecting to my computer. And that's since I retired a couple of years ago, my lecture voice has not been used that much. And so you can hear that I'm getting a little bit hoarse. I hope I can make it through this talk. So let's start out with some data on learning. We know that expressions of emotion are amongst our first behaviors, crying, cooing, smiling, and so on. And similarly, emotion words are learned and used early. And this is a table put together by Inga Brotherton that shows for 28-month-olds, 2.5-year-old children, the percentage that use various emotions in talking about either themselves or others, and the percentage that that have used these emotion terms in talking about themselves and others. And for the positive emotions, you can see, that these small children have used these words a lot. They use them frequently. And it's also true for negative emotions like sad and scared and scary and so on. And so these children have picked up on these emotion terms. They've learned these emotion terms very early. Now that emotion is important for some of the earliest learning of words. Let me now talk about some work of some colleagues of mine on the production and perception of words, and how literally the production of words codes emotion. So I'm going to talk about a couple of effects here, what we call the gleam-glum effect, and what Mike Macbeth calls the Wham-Woom effect. And let me just start out by showing you the data for this gleam-glum effect. What we did was to get in English, every minimal pair of single syllable words that differ in only the middle vowel sound. So you can see, hopefully you can see up here, there's peace and pus and gleam and glum, and all of the pairs of English words that differ only in the E or the And we ask people, which one of these words is, do you think is the more positive word? And tell us how much more positive. And they use these smaller numbers to indicate how much more positive, for example, peace is than pus. If they were to use the word, then it shows a line over here. And what you see is that 66% of all these word pairs in English, not just a couple of special ones, but of all of the word pairs in English, that 66% show that the E word, like gleam, is seen as more positive than the word, as in glum. And, why should that be? Probably many of you have already come up with the hypothesis that we thought was reasonable. And that's that the E words, when you say them, you're using much of the same musculature as when you're smiling. And the words, when you say them, you're using much of the same musculature as when you're frowning. And so perhaps over the course of language evolution, we've picked out words that cause us to feel happy by smiling and associated them with more positive meanings. Well, if that's the mechanism, that it has to do with our musculature, well, then you would think that it should be found not just in English, but in many of the world's languages. And in fact, here are the data from Mandarin. that again, here, 63% of all of the minimal word pairs in Mandarin that differ only in the E versus A sound, again, 63% of them, of those pairs, people find the E word to be more positive than the word. Well, and if this account in terms of musculature is correct, well, then we ought to be able to play with that experimentally. And what we did in these studies was to have people do the ratings under 3 conditions. The standard condition is what we did in the first couple of studies, the Mandarin one and the English one, where they simply rated these words by reading them silently and then choosing, which one was more positive. But we thought, wow, if we had them read the words out loud, well, then it should force them to use the musculature and make the effect even stronger. And that's what you see here. Similarly, if we interfere with the musculature by having them chew gum while they're doing the rating, that should reduce the effect. And so here you see the 3 conditions of reading aloud, silent, and chewing gum in English. And here you see the data for Mandarin. And so it seems that the very way we pronounce words has an emotional impact. And so here's the little bit on the Wham womb effect. And by the way, this is where the language in this talk is going to get R-rated soon. So what Mike Macbeth found, well, just quoting from one of his papers, we found that participants rated the ah words like wham as more rousing or less calming than the oo words like womb, with a really large effect size. And then in a paper with a great title, this Macbeth and Patton, with the title, "Fuck you, you asshole," what they found was that American and British swear words were found to be more likely containing the a and the phonemes than others. And again, here with a very large effect size. So here's Mike Macbeth's take on what might be going on. So starting out with the Russell circumplex model of emotion that has these 2 main dimensions, the valence dimension going from positive to negative emotions, and then an arousal dimension going from more active to more passive emotions. And then Mike mapped onto that these 4 phonemes that also seem to convey these 2 dimensions, and these mouth shapes that seem to convey these dimensions. And Macbeth proposes that we've evolved mechanisms to maximally discriminate between these phonemes because they convey emotional information corresponding to the facial features. And so here our ability to perceive and to produce these phonemes and to get the meaning of the communication behind them seems to be because of their relation to emotion. So let me go on now to some aspects that are more standardly related to language, like prosody and syntax. Now, let me start out with this notion from Kreiner and Eviatar that the missing link in the embodiment of syntax is prosody. That is, syntax is clearly important for language, but that doesn't mean that the way we deal with syntax when we're processing language is in terms of, rules and manipulation of abstract symbols. Kreiner and Eviatar propose that one of the main mechanisms for dealing with syntax is prosody. So they say prosodic features such as stress, pitch, and rhythm organize the acoustic stream within temporal structures that distinguish between grammatical categories and group words into phrases in a hierarchical structure. And just as a simple demonstration, when we say a sentence such as this, George ate the apples and the oranges, we indeed use the timing, the temporal structure, to indicate the syntactic structure by grouping together the apples and the oranges. And if the sentence were to continue as a garden path sentence, George ate the apples and the oranges were eaten by his sister. Well, right, this is hard to understand because prosody has produced the wrong hierarchical structure. And of course, we would almost never say this sentence this way unless we were trying to fool somebody in a psychology experiment. If we were, just communicating amongst people, we would almost certainly say, George ate the apples and the oranges were eaten by his sister. The point being that we use prosody to convey the syntax of the sentence. But then what about prosody and emotion? I mean, what's that relation like? Well, we've already seen it in a bit in this Macbethan pattern of "fuck you, you asshole." But we can also see it on the other dimension where we use prosodic features, a lilting way of talking, when we're talking with young children and when mothers talk to their infants, that they use their prosody to convey affection. Now, a lot of these ideas were brought together by Shearer in this wonderful paper, Vocal Communication of Emotion. And one of the things that Shearer points out, very quickly, is that these aren't new ideas. They're not new discoveries of cognitive psychology. That the relation between prosody and emotion is discussed in classical manuals on rhetoric. But then, and here's the way Shearer proposes why there is this relationship. He says that emotional arousal of the speaker is accompanied by physiological changes that will affect respiration, phonation, and articulation in such a way as to produce emotion-specific patterns of acoustic parameters. So in other words, when I am feeling the emotion that leads to "fuck you, you asshole," that emotional arousal is literally affecting my bodily system, the respiration, the phonation, the articulation, to produce those particular patterns. And here's what Shearer proposes those patterns are. And so looking at the various emotional states up here and how they affect these components of production in terms of intensity, in terms of various components of fundamental frequency, sentence contours, high frequency energy, and so on. Well, excuse me, perhaps for many of us, more important than this table documenting these changes is to show that people are sensitive, that listeners are sensitive to these changes. And so here's a summary of some 20 studies done in with Western languages of the sensitivity to facial cues to emotion. So here we see the emotions, and we see the percentage of times over these 20 studies that people could identify the emotion from facial features. And you can see it's pretty high. But it's also the case that people are pretty good at identifying these emotions from the vocal features. And it's not just in Western languages, but also in non-Western languages. People are good at recognizing the emotion from the facial features, but also from the vocal features. And so we see that prosody, perhaps the embodiment of syntax, conveys emotion as well as structure. Well, what about syntax itself? So I haven't been able to find a lot of work on this, but a couple of papers by David Havis. This one looks at campaign speeches, and in particular, looks at whether these campaign speeches use the imperfective past tense or the perfective past tense. So for example, for a couple of examples of the imperfective, where the action is described as continuing. The folks here were holding signs as opposed to the folks here held signs. Or electricity was running through my arm as opposed to electricity ran through my arm. And Havis gave these versions of these campaign speeches, or these sentences from campaign speeches, to groups of people using MTurk, online participants, and found that the valence ratings for the imperfective were larger than the valence ratings. Well, this is valence ratings in an absolute sense, so both positive and negative. Those valence ratings were greater for the imperfective than for the perfective. As you can see, it's not a huge effect, but it's a statistically significant effect. And then looking at this in a slightly different way, in a more recent presentation, what Havis did was to look at former President Trump's tweets and whether they were in the imperfective or the perfective. And what he found was that imperfective tweets got some 4,000 more favorites than the perfectives, and the imperfective tweets got on average 700 more retweets than the perfective tweets. And so it looks like some syntactic structures, some syntactic constructions convey or at least encourage emotion. Well, we can continue. We will continue. So emotion plays an important role in meaning. And a lot of this work comes from the laboratory of my former colleague, Gabriela Bilioco. And in this paper, the claim is that abstract words are more strongly associated with emotion than are concrete words. In other words, emotion is one of the ways that we ground the meaning of abstract words. So for example, many people won't be able to give a good definition of, for example, fascism or democracy, but they'll be able to tell you that fascism is something they don't like. Communism is something I don't like. Whereas democracy, oh yes, that's something that I do like. That we use emotion to understand, at least in part, the meaning of many abstract words. And then in a later paper, they showed that abstract words are more strongly associated with functional magnetic resonance activity in the anterior cingulate cortex that is associated with emotional processing. And then returning a bit again to learning, this paper demonstrated that abstract words with emotional valence are learned better than neutral abstract words, at least by children up to the ages of about 8 or 9. That is, again, apparently these children were using the emotion to help them understand these words, to ground the meaning of these words. And moving beyond individual words to comprehension, in this case, comprehension of sentences. This is one of my favorite articles of mine. So as David Havis's dissertation, we presented to participants sentences to read that we wrote to try to convey anger or sadness or happiness. And this main effect that you see here is relatively uninteresting. It's really, so this is the amount of time it took them to read these sentences. And the reason it took so much more time for the angry sentences is just that they were much longer. We had to use more words to convey the anger in this situation. What's really important in this experiment is the participants. They were all middle-aged women who were at a Botox clinic. As many of you know, Botox can be used as a cosmetic treatment. And if you inject the Botox in the right places and carefully, because it can kill you if not. So Botox is a neurotoxin that essentially blocks the muscle activity. And if, for example, you inject it in the corrugator muscle in your forehead, pretty much between your eyebrows, what that will do is to block the activity of the corrugator muscle, and it then eliminates the lines in your forehead. And so it can be used as a cosmetic treatment. Well, the women in this study were first-time participants, first-time patients at a Botox clinic, and they were getting Botox in their corrugator muscle, and only the corrugator muscle. That was important for the study. And here are their reading times before the injection of the Botox. And then after injection of the Botox, they came back to the clinic for a standard checkup, and we measured them again in a counterbalanced set of sentences. Well, why did we do this? Well, because if in fact emotion and emotion expression is part of the process of understanding these sentences, well, for those sentences, for angry sentences and sad sentences, that would generally require the corrugator muscle, if we block that muscle, we ought to slow down the understanding of these sentences. And indeed, at the second session, here is slower processing of the angry sentences, slower processing of the sad sentences, but for happy sentences, where the emotion is expressed more around the mouth and more around the eyes, well, those muscles weren't blocked. And we see no difference in the processing time of the happy sentences. And so bodily expression of emotion plays a role in comprehension of sentences. All right. Let me offer just one more possibility here, and this is really more of a possibility. I don't have any data on this one, and it is that emotion may play a role not just in the structuring of sentences and the grouping of words to convey the syntax of the sentence, but emotion may also be used to structure our understanding of discourse. Well, we know from decades of research, well, probably centuries of people, thinking about this, that discourse, that stories have a structure beyond that of the individual sentences, that somehow we group some sentences together and not others. We group some events together and not others. And within cognitive psychology, people have tried to understand this grouping in terms of scripts very early on, the Schenck and Abelson idea that people understand stories in terms of well-learned structures, for example, a birthday party script or an eating out at a restaurant script. And then there were other hypotheses that we use story grammars. So we know, at least in Western cultures, the structure of a story, that it has a background, that it has initiating events, it has goals and attempts to reach those goals. And we use that knowledge of the structure of stories to group the sentences and the events. And more recently, we cognitive psychologists talked about mental models of various sorts for doing that grouping. And one of the most prominent accounts of mental models is by Swan and Radvansky. And they propose that when we're understanding a story in particular, that we're tracking various components, and we're using these components to structure the events. And they suggest that we track space, that we track causation, the intentionality and the goals. We track the protagonists and the objects. We track how time is changing. And that's it, these 5. But it seems like something's missing, right? I mean, if I was correct the way I started this talk, that much of the content of language has emotion or is about emotional experiences. Where is that in Swan and Radvansky? It's just not there. It's certainly not there explicitly. And I think what this reflects is that there's this bias in cognitive psychology not to treat emotion, that it's not a cognitive process, and it's something that we leave to the social psychologists, that we leave it to the clinical psychologists. But I think we're leaving it to those other areas of psychology at our own detriment. So how might it be that emotion can guide the development of a mental model? Let me just try some ideas here. So this is a standard account of language comprehension from an embodied point of view, that language requires simulation using perception, action, and emotional systems. So for example, consider a sentence like, you and your lover walk hand in hand down the moonlit tropical beach. The idea of simulation is that we use words like moonlit tropical beach to drive our perceptual system, in this case, mainly visual system. We use these words to drive the visual system into a state that is homologous to the state of literally seeing a moonlit tropical beach. And similarly, we use a word like walk to drive our action system into a state that's homologous to literally walking. And we use things like you and your lover and holding hands to drive our emotional system. So we use words to simulate the perception, action, and emotion. Those simulations, by literally activating bodily systems of emotion, that those activations are going to prepare or prime you for action. That is, that's what emotion does, is to get you to act. So by simulating, we are preparing for action. We are prepared to understand the following language because we know what we would do in that situation. We know what we would do if we were walking with our lover on the moonlit tropical beach. Then finally, given that much of the content of language involves emotion, and that emotion prepares us for effective intrapersonal, interpersonal, and cultural actions, well, then we can use the emotional states to make connections across sentences and paragraphs, thereby creating connected mental models. That is, the emotion gets to appreciate what the following action should be, and so we know how to connect up components of the text. So, all right, let me speculate a little bit on why emotion may be central to language. I think one is the social evolutionary gloss, and that's that humans are social animals. We need to live in societies if we are going to survive. And that success in a social environment is dependent on the ability to both convey emotion and read emotions of others. Why is that? Because emotion is going to tell us what the other person is likely to do next. And similarly, our emotional expression allows that other person to know what we're going to do. So that emotional expression is greasing the wheels of social interaction. Well, language evolved within this constraint of living in social environments. And so, of course, to the extent that language can help us convey these emotional states and help us read emotional states, that is going to be a prompt towards the evolution of language encoding emotion. But I think we can also come up with a processing account. And this is where I want to return to Hutchinson and Feldman Barrett. They propose that the brain operates on the principle of predictive coding. One way of thinking about that principle is that it includes both simulating and then updating those simulations. So predictive coding is a type of top-down processing of simulating and then correcting once the data are obtained. And one of the clearest expositions of predictive coding is this paper by Rao and Ballard in 1999, where they propose a sequence of making a prediction, and then from that making finer grained predictions, and then finally looking at the input. And if the input differs from the predictions, then adjusting what those predictions are. So for example, if you are intending to take a walk in the park, or you are taking a walk in the park, well, you're going to be predicting, for example, the colors you see, the shapes you see, the objects you see. And if this is what you're literally seeing, that input matches the predictions very well. And so there are very little error signal. There's very little adjustment that needs to be made here, very little adjustment that needs to be made here, that you are, in fact, taking a walk in the park. But if what you see, instead of a park in Montreal, if this is what you see, well then, oh my goodness, well, that input has a tremendous mismatch with, for example, the shapes of the things you're going to be seeing. It has a tremendous mismatch with predictions about, the general atmosphere. All of these error signals are going to cause you to update what it is you think is going on, what you're perceiving, and you say, oh my God, I'm in Arizona, I have to watch out for rattlesnakes. So this is the general idea of predictive coding. What Hutchinson and Feldman Barrett add is a really interesting notion that the topmost source of predictions or simulations is the limbic system, not something that is explicitly cognitive, but something that is much closer to emotion and to affect. That they say the system anticipates energy needs with affective consequences, what they call allostasis, that what's really important is how we balance our output and our intake of energy. And so it's that at the highest level that is driving these simulations of what we should perceive and the actions that we should be taking. Furthermore, they claim that learning requires energy, not in a metaphorical sense, but that these updates here, due to these error signals updating these predictive estimators, changing the simulations, that requires literally glucose to be consumed by your neurons. And that is why we're always trying to make accurate predictions and to take accurate actions given the environment, because we don't want to waste energy updating these predictions. And so it's from this that Hutchinson and Feldman Barrett say affect is part of every psychological phenomenon, even those that are not explicitly emotional, because every psychological phenomenon is ultimately concerned with allostasis, with the expenditure and the intake of energy. So let me first say, well, I think I'm going, well, yeah, let me do this. No, I'm not going to. I'm just going to head to finishing this up since I see we're at close to 50 minutes. So let me just develop some implications here. Oh, just sort of not so much a scientific implication, but an educational one. So why do so many people find cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics in particular so, we in this seminar are the nerds who may not find it so boring, but most of our undergraduate students certainly do. And I think the answer is because, indeed, we're ignoring a central phenomenon. Namely, we're ignoring how it is that language encodes and conveys emotion. And our undergraduates know that. And so they think that our analysis of psycholinguistics, for example, is off center. It's not getting at the central facts. And then similarly, why do so many people find STEM learning so difficult? STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math. And I think from this point of view of allostasis, we can start to understand that a bit. I think there are probably many reasons, but from this point of view, we can understand that STEM learning often requires a lot of updating of those predictions because before we've learned the technical situation, we're making poor predictions. And so it requires a lot of energy to form those new connections, to make those new simulations. And so it's difficult to do. Our system is saying, don't do it. It's going to require too much energy compared to what you're getting out of it. And then, sort of going to more current events, why do some people find it so easy to believe conspiracy theories? And why is it that simply stating the truth just doesn't change their minds? Well, clearly, there are many answers to this or potential answers to this, but I think we can also propose three from the point of view of emotion being central to language. One is that, again, it's going to require energy to update those beliefs. That is, to update the simulations. And some people may just decide it's not worth it to expend that energy, just like they may say that it's not worth it to climb a hill, to get a different view, a literal different view on the environment. It may not be worth it to get a different view on political situation. I think here's another reason why this may be difficult. When we're taking the walk in the park and things aren't what we expected, well, that the information is right there in front of us. It's being processed by perceptual systems. We have no option other than to process the fact that we're seeing saguaro cacti and not lakes in the middle of Montreal. But when we're trying to convince people about a political point, that alternative political point can only be appreciated through creating a simulation, that is, using our words to drive these systems. It's not a direct environmental stimulus. And so again, it's going to be using excess energy or extra energy to create that simulation that then might be useful in updating those beliefs. And then finally, creating that new simulation may be emotionally painful. It may be literally repulsive or disgusting, for example, for a Trumpista to consider that Biden is the duly elected president of the United States, that having to form that simulation is emotionally painful. And their reaction to that pain is to get away from it, to stop the pain, to stop the simulation. And so they never get a chance to update their beliefs. And finally, the last point is that I think many of our standard linguistic analyses are incomplete. So for example, if we go back to Hackett's work on the design features of language, two of those that people thought were important. One is that language generally has arbitrary features. Well, maybe some aspects of language are arbitrary, but some are not. Consider the gleam-glum effect. Well, that's not about just a couple of words. That effect pervades all of English, and as far as we can determine, all of Mandarin. And so it's not arbitrary that some words convey pleasant situations and others convey unpleasant, that the choice of those phonemes is related to our production. And another of Hackett's design features is that linguistic representations are discrete. Well, some are, but not all. I mean, consider prosody, right? We use prosody in a non-discrete way, that I can raise the volume of my voice in different increments. I can group the words in different ways. It's simply not discrete. And finally, if we consider people like Hauser, Chomsky, and Fitch, who want us to believe that the uniquely human part of language is recursion. And I think what they mean to imply in addition is that this is the most interesting component of language because it's uniquely human, and that this is the thing that we should study. Well, to that I say, cut the crap and get real. No, excuse me. What I say is, cut the crap and get real. Namely, that a central component of language is the ability to use embodied mechanisms to encode and convey emotion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for all those great questions.
Thank you very much, Art.